So, good evening, students. So, hope all are doing well, right? So, we have started discussing with a series of lectures on the common diseases which are usually seen in case of humans, right? So, we started talking about different categories of diseases which are usually seen affecting the human individuals. So, with regards to that, we started off with something called as the viral disease. That was the first category of disease what we took up, the viral disease. Second category what we took up was the second category was with regards to the bacterial disease. The third category what we took up was with regards to the fungal disease. The fourth category was elemental disease, right? So till the previous session, we have started discussing about all of these four different categories of disease. So we saw one or two diseases in each of the category, right? So just a quick look back of what we have seen in the previous session, and today we'll start off with today's session, right? So initially we actually began with the viral disease. So under viral disease, we saw about one particular disease which is called as the common cold or rhinitis, right? So we saw a few things with regards to the causative organism of that disease. Number two was with regards to the mode of infection, how this disease is being transmitted or how it spreads from a person to another person. And the third one, what we saw is with regards to the symptoms that are associated with each of the disease. So these are the three things what we saw. One is the causative organism, the pathogen. Number two, the mode of infection. And number three, how or what are the symptoms that are associated with this disease, right? So that was the thing what we saw with regards to common cold. And with regards to the second category, that is bacterial disease, we took up with two diseases under the head bacterial disease, right? Even though there are n number of bacterial diseases which have been identified, two of the most common diseases we have studied, one was called typhoid and the other one was called pneumonia, right? So with regards to typhoid and pneumonia also, we saw about the pathogen that is involved in that for those two diseases. Along with that, the mode of infection, how these diseases are being transmitted from person to person. And the third one was the symptoms that are associated with those particular diseases. Moving on to the third category, we took up with the fungal disease. And in the fungal disease, we took about one disease which is called as the ringworm. I told you that it is considered as one of the most contagious diseases. One of the most contagious fungal disease is this particular disease called as ringworm. So we saw three different species or three different genera of organisms involved in causing this disease: Microsporium, Trichophyton, Epidermatophyton, three different genera of organisms causing this disease called as ringworm. There also we took up the mode of infection, how it is being transmitted. I told you that it is through direct contact. And then we also saw some of the symptoms, major symptoms associated with that disease. And in the previous session, right, in the last session, we spoke about two elemental disease also, right? Elemental disease, I told you they are usually called as the worms, right? Mostly the roundworms. So with regards to that, we took up with two elemental disease. One is called Ascariasis and the other one is called Phyllariasis, right? So we saw how Ascariasis is being caused, right? So the mode of infection, the pathogen for Ascariasis was Ascaris lumbricoides, right? The mode of infection, how it is being transmitted, I told you that it is through contaminated food and water, right? And we saw some of the symptoms associated with Ascaris. The next disease what we saw was Phyllariasis. We also call it as elephantiasis. We saw about the causative organisms there also, Wuchereria bancrofti and Wuchereria mali, right? So we saw how they are actually transmitted from person to person. I told you that it is through the bite of an infected female Culex mosquito, right? So infected Culex mosquito would lead to this particular disease called as Phyllariasis, and some of the symptoms also that are associated with Phyllariasis, right? We also call it as elephantiasis because of the appearance of elephant-like legs because of severe infection of this particular disease. Then we saw some of the symptoms also associated with that, right? So with that, we saw almost four different categories of diseases, right? And some of the common diseases in each of the category. Now, all the diseases what we have seen, they are all said to be infectious disease, right? So what do we mean by an infectious disease? The disease which can spread from person to person. We call it as infectious disease. And in all the diseases that we saw, some of them are said to be contagious disease. Some of them are said to be non-contagious diseases also. Can you just recollect which are contagious and which are non-contagious, right? Contagious disease was this particular thing, common cold. Pneumonia is contagious, then the ringworm is also contagious. Non-contagious disease, we saw about these other ones, right? Such as typhoid, right? Then we saw about other diseases also, such as Ascariasis and Phyllariasis, right? So those were the things what we have discussed till the previous session, right? In today's session, we'll take up with two more diseases which are left out in the list, right? So we have one last list to take up, and that is called as the protozoan diseases. So let's begin with protozoan diseases, and we'll be talking about two most common protozoan diseases which are seen affecting the humans, right? Then we'll get into the next topics, right? So let's begin with the protozoan diseases. So talking about protozoan diseases. So there are a lot of protozoan diseases which have been identified by the doctors as well as scientists. So there are a lot of protozoan diseases which have been identified, of which some of the common protozoan disease what we know is number one, malaria. I hope all would have heard about malaria, and some of us would have experienced also malaria, right? So malaria is one of the protozoan disease, right? Second one, we have something called as amoebiasis. It is also called as amoebic dysentery. Other diseases, it includes something called as giardiasis, right? Along with giardiasis, there is another disease also which is called as sleeping sickness, right? There is one more disease also called as kala azar. There is one more also which is called as Delhi boils, right? So these are some of the common protozoan diseases what we have come across. At least a few of them we would have heard now and then. In this session or in this lecture, we'll be taking up with two most common protozoan diseases, right? Of which the first one what we'll be taking up is called amoebiasis. It is also called as amoebic dysentery. And the second one what we'll be taking up is another well-known disease which is called as malaria, right? So let's begin first with the disease called as amoebiasis. Amoebiasis, right? Or it is also called as amoebic dysentery, right? It is either called amoebiasis or it is also called as amoebic dysentery, right? Now let's get into this amoebiasis as well as amoebic dysentery. Now what is this disease all about? So this is one of the disease which is usually seen affecting the large intestine, right? One of the disease which is seen infecting the large intestine. If you recollect, few sessions back we saw about one of the disease which infects the small intestine. So which was that disease? Typhoid, right? So typhoid usually infects the large intestine, whereas this disease, that is amoebiasis, is usually seen infecting the large intestine, right? So let's take up with the general characters, right? Positive organisms, the pathogen. Second one, the mode of infection, and the third one is the symptoms, right? So in that juncture, let's first begin with the causative organism, pathogen, right? So which is the causative organism of amoebiasis? Right. So amoebiasis is caused by an organism called as Entamoeba histolytica. Right? It is caused by an organism called as Entamoeba histolytica. So this is the pathogen or the causative organism of this particular disease called as amoebiasis. Right? So the disease amoebiasis or amoebic dysentery is caused by an organism called as Entamoeba histolytica. I'll tell you why it is called histolytica once we take up with the symptoms. So based on the symptoms, they have been given this particular term called as histolytica or histolytica. Right. Now, talking about the mode of infection, how does this disease or organism spread from person to person? So, talking about the mode of infection, right? So, the mode of infection here is contaminated food and water. Contaminated food and water, right? So, by taking contaminated food and water, or by eating the food and water which has been contaminated by this particular disease, this particular organism called Entamoeba histolytica, a person would usually get this sort of a disease called as amoebiasis. Right. Now, one more important thing what you need to remember here is one particular organism called as housefly. Right. So this organism, housefly, usually acts as a mechanical It acts as a mechanical vector. Right? It acts as a mechanical vector. Now, what do we mean by this term vector? Right? So, what do we mean by a vector? Vector is nothing but a carrier. Right? It is a vehicle. Right? So, it is a carrier or a vehicle. A carrier or a vehicle which is used to carry certain organisms from person to person. We start calling them as a vector. Right? So, what do we mean by a vector? A vehicle, right? A vehicle or a carrier which is used to carry organisms from one place to the other place. We start calling it as a vector. So basically we have two types of vectors. One is called biological vector and the other one what we have mentioned here as a mechanical vector. So there are two types of vectors. One is called a biological vector. Second one is a mechanical vector. Now what is the difference between these two? A biological vector and a mechanical vector. In biological vector, what happens is the life cycle of the organism is completed in that particular organism. Right? So what happens in biological vector? For the pathogen completely depends on the vector for completing its life cycle. Getting it? Such type of a vector, we start calling it as a biological vector. Right? So what, let me repeat it once again. In case of a biological vector, what happens is the pathogen pathogen requires the vector for completing its life cycle. So without a vector, the life cycle of the pathogen or the organism is not complete. Such type of a vector, we start calling them as a biological vector. Here we are talking about mechanical vector. So in mechanical vector, what happens is this vector simply carries the pathogen from one place to the other place. Even without this vector, the life cycle of this organism would be complete. But that's not the case with a biological vector, right? In biological vector, what happens is that particular vector is required for the completion of the life cycle of the vector. That's the reason why we call it as biological vector. Here we are just calling it as a mechanical vector. So housefly acts as a mechanical vector. Whereas if you see in case of malaria, mosquito acts as a biological vector. Right? In case of in case of malaria, mosquito acts as a biological vector. Why biological vector? Because a part of life cycle occurs in the mosquito. That will take up in a few moments from now. Once we are done with this, we'll study even about the life cycle of this organism, protozoan called Plasmodium Malaria, in a few moments from now. For now, remember that mode of infection of Entamoeba histolytica is through contaminated food and water, right? And one very important thing, houseflies will start acting as a vector in transferring or transmitting the disease from or transmitting these organisms from the feces to the food or water that we take. That's the reason why people say do not eat anything, right? Do not eat anything, especially the street foods. Do not eat any of the street foods. Why do not eat street foods? Because that is the place where we see houseflies hovering around the food or the water that is placed there. Right. So if any food has houseflies on it, there are chances that the houseflies might be spreading this particular disease, or this will be spreading this particular organism called Entamoeba histolytica. So see to it that the food that you eat do not have this particular housefly. It has not been contaminated by this housefly. So if we start eating it, definitely we'll be prone to this sort of a disease called as Entamoeba histolytica. Right? This is what we have with the mode of infection. Now talking about the symptoms associated with this. Right? So talking about the symptoms. What are the symptoms associated with this? I already told you that this particular organism usually resides in the large intestine, right? So this organism, I told you, it usually resides in the large intestine, right? It is usually found growing in the large intestine. And since it grows in the large intestine, it usually feeds on the tissues of the walls of the large intestine, right? Make a note of it. This organism usually feeds on the tissues of the walls of the large intestine. Now, once it starts feeding on the tissues that are present on the walls of the large intestine, what do you think would happen? All the tissues that are present on the walls of the large intestine would be damaged. It would be lysed. That is the reason it is called as histolytica. What do we mean by histolytica? Histo stands for tissues. We are very much familiar with it. Histo stands for tissues. The study of tissues is called histology. We have studied it long back, right? So histo stands for tissues. Lytica stands for something called as lysis, breakdown, right? So what is this organism doing? Once it gets into the large intestine, it starts feeding on the tissues that are present in the walls of the large intestine. As a result of which, it brings about lysis of the tissues that are present in the walls of the small intestine. Therefore, it is termed as histolytica. This organism is usually referred to as Entamoeba histolytica. That is what. Now, what does that lead to? Due to the damage to the walls or due to the lysis of the walls of the large intestine, the individual will start suffering from ulcers. I hope all of you would have been familiar with this term, ulcers. The individual will start suffering from ulcers of the large intestine. Along with that, there are some more symptoms, common symptoms associated with this disease. Right? Common symptoms include the individual will suffer from severe abdominal pain. Severe abdominal pain, right? So the individual suffer from severe abdominal pain followed by abdominal cramps. I hope some of you would have familiar with the term cramps. What do we mean by a cramp? It is nothing but a sudden involuntary contraction of the muscles, right? All of a sudden, there is some sort of involuntary contraction of the muscles. At that point of time, there will be sudden pain, and within a few seconds, it will again come back to normal, right? So those kinds of things we start calling it as cramps, right? So the individual affected with this organism called Entamoeba histolytica will have ulcers, right? Because of the damage to the walls or damage to the tissues that are present in the walls of the intestine. Second thing, they would suffer from severe abdominal pain as well as cramps. The next condition here is, symptom here is, the individual will suffer from constipation. The individual will suffer from constipation, right? And along with that, the stools of this particular individual, right? The stools of this particular individual will be rich in mucus, or there will be excess mucus present in the stool, and there will be blood clots in the stools. This is one more symptom that is actually associated with this disease called Entamoeba histolytica, or this disease called Amoebiasis. Constipation followed by stools will have excess of mucus, right? Will have excess of mucus, and along with that, there will be some sort of blood clots also present in the stools. So these are some of the common symptoms associated with this disease called as amoebiasis, right? So amoebiasis or amoebic dysentery is caused by a pathogen called as Entamoeba histolytica, right? Mode of infection, contaminated food and water. Houseflies, they act as a mechanical vector in transmitting the disease from the feces to the food as well as water, contaminating them. Common symptoms, there is damage to the walls of the large intestine, tissues that are present in the walls of the large intestine, as a result of which it would lead to the formation or development of ulcers. Second one, abdominal pain followed by abdominal cramps, right? Then there is constipation seen. Along with that, the stools will be seen with excess of mucus as well as blood clots also, right? So this is what we have with this particular disease called as amoebiasis, or also called as amoebic dysentery, right? So this is what we have with this particular disease, right? Next, after we are done with amoebiasis or amoebic dysentery, the next disease what we'll be taking up is called as the most common disease, which is called as malaria, right? As I've already mentioned, we have heard about this particular disease, and not only heard, some of us would have also experienced this sort of a disease, right? So talking about malaria here, right? Talking about malaria. So malaria is a very well-known protozoan disease, what we all are familiar with. Right. Now talking about the causative organism of this particular disease called as malaria. Right. So there is one particular genus called as Plasmodium. Right. So the first one, pathogen. So talking about pathogen, the pathogen here is Plasmodium species. So there are different species of Plasmodium which actually cause this sort of a disease called as malaria, right? So there are 4 major species of this Plasmodium genus, right? So let us see those 4 different species, and we'll see what type of malaria does each of the species cause. The first one, right? The first one is, it is called as Plasmodium vivax. Vivax. So this is the first pathogen or first species, which is called Plasmodium vivax, right? So this Plasmodium vivax causes a malaria which is called as benign tertian malaria. It causes something called as benign tertian malaria. Now, how do we define these terms, or what do we mean by this term, benign, tertian, and malaria? Benign stands for harmless, right? Benign stands for harmless. So, malaria that is caused by this organism, that is Plasmodium vivax, is usually considered as a harmless disease because of its nature. Second, tertian. What do we mean by tertian? One of the common symptoms that is associated with malaria, if you know or if you would have experienced it, one of the common symptoms associated with malaria is fever, right? We call it as relapsing fever or recurring fever, right? So the fever is usually seen for every 3 days. Sometimes in some cases it is seen usually for every 4 days also, right? So during this interval, the fever is seen. First day there is fever, second, third day there is no fever, again fourth day the fever comes in. Again, fifth, sixth day there is no fever, seventh day again the fever comes. Right. So for every 3 to 4 days, the fever starts relapsing. It starts recurring. Right. So if fever relapses every third day, we call it as tertian malaria. Right. Tertian stands for every third day. It is a harmless malaria. Right. The risk levels are said to be very low, and the fever usually is seen on for every third day. This is what we mean by benign tertian malaria, which is caused by a pathogen called as Plasmodium vivax. Clear? Right. Next, moving on to the next pathogen, which is called as Plasmodium falciparum. Right. So talking about Plasmodium falciparum. So Plasmodium falciparum is the second species, which leads to something called as malignant. It leads to malignant tertian malaria. Right, malignant tertian malaria. Now again, it is a tertian malaria. So what does that mean? For every third day, the fever is usually seen. It is usually recurring on every third day. Now what do we mean by the term malignant here? Malignant means harmful, right? Malignant means harmful. When we take up with the topic called as cancer, there also will be getting into these two terms: benign cancer as well as malignant cancer, benign tumors and malignant tumors. There again we'll get into more details with regards to the benign and the malignant terms. For now, remember that benign is harmless, the risk levels are said to be low. Malignant is said to be harmful, the risk levels are said to be higher. Right. Now, malignant tertian malaria, high risk of infection. Tertian, for every 3 days, again the fever relapses. The fever relapses for every 3 days. Right. So this is the second species. The third species is Plasmodium ovale. OVALE. The third species is Plasmodium ovale. Plasmodium ovale causes again a mild tertian malaria. Mild tertian malaria. Right. So there is actually one more name also given for this malignant tertian malaria. It is also called as cerebral malaria. It is also called cerebral malaria because it is usually seen affecting the cerebrum, that is the brain, right? It's usually seen affecting the brain. There is one more name also given for it. It is also called as black water fever, right? Other name is black water fever or cerebral malaria, or simply we can call it as malignant tertian malaria, right? Next, Plasmodium ovale. It causes mild tertian malaria, right? So again, the risk is said to be low, right? It causes mild malaria, and it is again a tertian malaria. Fever relapses again for every third day. In every third day, the fever again relapses. The last species which has been identified is Plasmodium malariae. Right, the third one is, or the last one is called Plasmodium malariae. Right, so this Plasmodium malariae, it causes something called as quartan malaria. Quartan malaria. Now, what do we mean by this quartan malaria? Tertian, we said fever relapses for every 3 days. Now here we are telling it as quartan malaria, where fever relapses for every 4th day. Right, so for every 4th day, the fever is seen relapsing. Right, so this is what we have with 4 different species of Plasmodium, which causes different types of malaria, right? So Plasmodium vivax causes benign tertian malaria. Plasmodium falciparum causes malignant tertian malaria. Plasmodium ovale, mild tertian malaria. And Plasmodium malaria, it causes quartan malaria, right? So this is what we have with the pathogen that is associated with this disease called as malaria, right? Now, talking about the mode of infection of this organism, right? So I'm just putting it down here, right? So the mode of infection. So the mode of infection of this organism. So how does this organism transmit from person to person? We are all very much familiar that it's transmitted through the bite of infected female Anopheles mosquito. Female Anopheles mosquito. Right? So this is how it is being infected from person to person. So it is being transmitted through the bite of the infected female Anopheles mosquito. So this term is actually important here, what you need to remember. Only an infected female Anopheles mosquito would cause malaria. A normal mosquito cannot cause malaria. Right? So this is what is the mode of infection, what we have. Right? Next, talking about the symptoms that are associated with this disease. So what are the symptoms that are associated with malaria? So as we have already said, right, one of the major symptoms associated with malaria is recurring fever. So talking about the symptoms, major symptoms that is associated with malaria is recurring fever, or we also call it as relapsing fever. Relapsing means coming again and again. So relapsing fever for every 3 or 4 days, right? So the fever would be relapsed for every 3 days or for every 4 days based on different species. If the infection is because of Plasmodium malariae, the fever would be recurring on every 4th day. If it is because of the other 3 species, vivax, falciparum as well as ovale, the fever would be seen for every 3 days, right? So one of the major symptoms or most common symptoms associated with this malaria is recurring fever or relapsing fever for every 3 or 4 days. Right. Now this relapsing fever, that is 3 or 4 days of relapsing fever, usually occurs in different stages, right? So there are different stages. 3 major stages have been identified with regards to this particular fever. So we'll see what are the 3 stages. First stage, what the scientists say is, the first stage is called as the cold stage. Right? So the first stage is referred to as the cold stage. Now what happens in this cold stage is there would be a lot of shivering and chills. Right? So in the cold stage, there would be a lot of shivering as well as chills. That is seen in the first stage, which is called the cold stage. Second stage is called as the hot stage. Hot stage, right? So the second stage is called as hot stage. Now what would happen in this particular hot stage? The temperature would be very high, right? So there would be high temperature in this particular stage. The temperature goes very high. Right. Next, the third stage here would be again something called as the sweating stage. It is called the sweating stage, where there would be profuse sweating, and the temperature would start becoming lower, and there would be lowering of temperature back to normal condition. Right? So this is the third stage, which is called the sweating stage. The first stage is called the cold stage, where there is shivering and chills seen. The second one is called the hot stage, where the temperature rises high. The temperature becomes too high. We call it as fever. And the third stage is the sweating stage, where there is profuse sweating followed by lowering of the temperature back to the normal. So if you say that for every 3 days, the fever is recurring, what does that mean? First day, the temperature is said to be high. Then again, sweating stage, temperature comes down the second day. Third day again, or rather first day here. Second day again, there would be shivering and chills. Again, third day, the temperature is high. Again, first day, profuse sweating. Second day, shivering. Third day, temperature again is high. So that's how the fever starts recurring for every 3 or 4 days. Right? So this is what we have with the common symptom that is associated with this disease called as malaria. Right? So with this, we are done with 2 protozoan diseases. One is called Amoebiasis, which we also call it as amoebic dysentery, and the second one is called malaria. Right? I hope these 2 diseases are also clear. So with this, we'll be completely done with our topic called as common diseases in case of humans. So before we wind up with this disease, let us now take up with the life history or life cycle of this particular organism called as Plasmodium vivax. Right? So let's take up with the life cycle of Plasmodium vivax. So we have already studied about this, but anyways, just a quick recap of what you have already studied in your early classes. Right? So we'll get into the details of the life cycle of this particular organism, Plasmodium vivax. Now, we know that Plasmodium vivax has 2 vectors. Right? There are 2 hosts actually present for Plasmodium vivax, not the vectors. There are 2 hosts which are a part of this particular organism. Right? So it completes its life cycle in 2 organisms. One is humans and the other one is mosquito. Right? So this organism, Plasmodium vivax, it completes its life cycle in 2 organisms, humans as well as the mosquito. Right? Now try to get this right. In case of humans, it undergoes the process called as asexual reproduction. Right? So in humans, it undergoes asexual mode of reproduction. And which type of asexual reproduction does it occur? It undergoes something called as multiple fission. So I hope all are familiar with multiple fission. You have studied in detail about all this process of sexual and asexual reproduction, right, in your previous sessions here. Right. Okay. So this particular organism, Plasmodium vivax, in the humans, it undergoes asexual mode of reproduction, which is called as multiple fission. Whereas in case of mosquitoes, it undergoes a sexual mode of reproduction. So these 2 things you should not get confused, right? In humans, it is asexual mode of reproduction, and that too by multiple fission. In case of mosquitoes, it is sexual mode of reproduction. Right? Now what we'll do is, let's divide the life cycle of mosquito into 2 phases. Human phase as well as the mosquito phase. Right? So let's see what happens in the human phase and let's see what happens in the mosquito phase. Let us first begin with the human phase, then we'll get into the mosquito phase. Right. Now, the infectious stage to humans is called as sporozoid. Right. So I'm actually beginning it from this side. Right. So the infectious stage to humans is sporozoites. Right. So this is the infectious stage to humans. This you need to remember. Right. So which is the infectious stage to humans? The infectious stage to humans is this sporozoid. Right. Now, this sporozoids enter into the humans. How does it enter into the humans? We just saw mode of infection. Whenever a female Anopheles mosquito having this sporozoids bites a normal human individual. Right. So whenever the female Anopheles mosquito having these sporozoids bites a normal human individual, these sporozoids will now enter into the blood of the humans. From the blood of the humans, it directly enters into an organ which is called as liver. Right? It would directly enter into the liver. This is the organ, the target organ for Plasmodium. Right? So what we are saying, once the sporozoids enters into the human blood, how is it entering into the human blood? By the bite of an infected female Anopheles mosquito. So that infected female Anopheles mosquito is dropping the sporozoids into the blood of the humans. Once it comes into the blood, from the blood, these sporozoids will go into the liver. Now, what is happening in the liver? Inside the liver, they undergo the process of asexual reproduction. That is, they undergo a process called as multiple fission. Right? So they are undergoing the process of asexual reproduction in the liver. That is through multiple fission. So that process of multiple fission, they also called it as, it is also called as schizogony. S-C-H-I-Z-O. It is also called as schizogony. Right? Schizogony is nothing but the process of multiple fission. Right? Now, as a result of multiple fission, what is happening? As a result of multiple fission, there are daughter cells which are being formed. And those daughter cells here, we start calling them as merozoites. Right? We start calling them as merozoites. Here, so what is happening? The sporozoites, they are entering into the liver. In the liver, they are multiplying, and after multiplication, the daughter sporozoites, we start calling them as merozoites. Clear with this so far? Now, what happens? Some of these merozoites, right? Some of these merozoites will start entering back into the fresh liver cells. Right? So they start entering into the fresh liver cells. Some of these merozoites that are formed, these merozoites will now start entering into the fresh liver cells, and they'll start infecting the fresh liver cells, and in the fresh liver cells, they'll start undergoing the process called as multiple fission. Clear? What is happening? First, the sporozoites are entering into the liver. In the liver, they are undergoing the process of asexual reproduction, and they are forming the merozoites. Now, what is happening? Some of the merozoites, again, they are evading the fresh liver cells, such that in the fresh liver cells, they are undergoing the process of multiple fission. So this process, entire process, usually takes place for almost 8 days. It takes place for almost 8 days. We usually call it as pre-latent period. Right? So during these 8 days of pre-latent period, there are no symptoms seen in the human individual. Right? Organism is already entered inside. It has already started doing its work. It is getting its food properly. It has started undergoing the process of multiplication, but still, what is happening? No symptoms are seen. Right? So it starts multiplying itself. Now what happens? I told you that some of the merozoites evade the fresh liver cells. Now there are some more merozoites left over. Now these some more merozoites, what they do is they start entering into the RBCs. Right? So they now start entering into the RBCs. So what happens in the RBC? Right? We can put it this way. Right? So some of the merozoites, they would start entering into the RBC. Right? Now what do they do in the RBC? In the RBC, they would now start feeding on the hemoglobin. They start feeds on the hemoglobin of the RBC. Now these merozoites which have entered into the RBC, they would now start feeding on the hemoglobin that is present inside the RBC. Once they start feeding on the hemoglobin, they would now start releasing a toxic substance called as hemozoin. Right? So they would start releasing a toxic substance called as hemozoin. Simultaneously, one side they are feeding on the hemoglobin of the RBC. Simultaneously, they would again start undergoing a process of multiple fission. They would again start undergoing the process of multiple fission in the RBC. So two places multiple fission is happening. One is liver and the other one is RBC. Right. So this is what is happening. So sporozoites entering into the humans, it is first entering into the liver. In the liver, multiple fission happening. Daughter cells, merozoites are formed. Now these merozoites, some of the merozoites will start evading the fresh liver cells and start attacking the fresh liver cells, and it would continue the process of multiple fission. Few more merozoites, whatever are there, they would enter into the RBC. Once they enter inside the RBC, they would now start feeding on the hemoglobin. Right? So they would now start feeding on the hemoglobin. As and when they are feeding on hemoglobin, they would start releasing a toxic substance called as hemozoin. Simultaneously, multiple fission is happening on the other side. Now, as a result of multiple fission, what would happen now? As a result of multiple fission, there are more of erythrocytic merozoites formed. More of daughter cells are formed inside the RBC. Once more of daughter cells are formed, these more daughter cells would now lead to the rupture of RBC. Right? So the RBC ruptures. Now, what would happen once the RBC ruptures? As the RBC ruptures, whatever erythrocytic merozoites are released. Erythrocytic merozoites merozoites are released into the blood, right? So erythrocytic merozoites are released into the blood. Once the erythrocytic merozoites are released into the blood, at the same time, hemozoin also is released. Hemozoin also is released into the blood. Now, here is the place where the symptoms will start appearing, right? So, when are the symptoms usually appearing in the humans? When the hemozoin is released into the blood. How is the hemozoin released into the blood? By the rupture of RBC. When is the RBC rupturing? When the erythrocytic merozoites are formed inside the RBC. Correct? Let me quickly go back through this again. Some of the merozoites I told you, they would enter into the RBC. Once they enter into the RBC, they would start feeding on the hemoglobin and would start releasing a toxic substance called as hemozoin. And simultaneously, the process of multiple fission is happening, leading to the formation of erythrocytic merozoites. Once more number of erythrocytic merozoites are formed, the RBC lysis occurs, RBC breakdown occurs, RBC ruptures. Once the RBC ruptures, what is happening? Erythrocytic merozoites are released, and at the same time, hemozoin is also released. Once hemozoin is released, that is the time where the symptoms will start appearing. So what symptoms appear? We just saw, right? Fever, will be getting fever once the hemozoin is being released. Clear this so far? Now what would happen? What would happen next? Once erythrocytic merozoites are released, these erythrocytic merozoites would now get differentiated into the gametocytes. It would get differentiated into the male as well as the female gametocytes. They would get differentiated into the male gametocyte as well as the female gametocyte. Right. So till here, we start calling it as the human face. Right. So till here, everything is said to be the human face. Now what happens next? Once the male and female gametes are formed in the blood, it is present in the blood. Now, when a normal female Anopheles mosquito comes and bites this particular patient, having the male and female gametocytes, now this male and female gametocytes would now enter into the stomach of the female Anopheles mosquito. It would now enter into the stomach of the female Anopheles mosquito. Now, what happens in the stomach of this particular mosquito? In the stomach of this mosquito, there is fertilization happening. There is fertilization happening, right? Formation of a diploid zygote is happening. Once fertilization happens, so I'm just taking this off, right? So once fertilization occurs, what would happen next? This zygote would now form another structure called as ookinete. It would form another structure called as the ookinete. Once the ookinete is formed, all this is happening in the stomach of the mosquito. In the stomach of the mosquito, fertilization is taking place. In the stomach of the mosquito, ookinete is also formed. Once the ookinete is formed in the stomach of the mosquito, then what would happen? This ookinete from the stomach of the mosquito, it would now start penetrating into the gut of the mosquito. Right? It would penetrate into the walls of the gut. You can put it this way. It penetrates into the gut wall. It would penetrate into the gut. Now, in the gut wall, it would now start forming a cyst. What we call it as the oocyst. So, in the gut wall, a oocyst is actually being formed. Now, inside the oocyst, the sporozoites are formed. Inside the oocyst, the sporozoites are formed. Now, these sporozoites would be released. They would be released from the gut wall and move into the salivary glands of the mosquito. Moves into the salivary glands of the mosquito. Once it moves into the salivary gland, when this mosquito comes and bites a normal individual, from the salivary glands of mosquito, it would again start entering into the humans, right? So this mosquito face and this is the human face, right? So clear with it? Let me go through it quickly once again and see what exactly is happening, right? So when an infected female Anopheles mosquito bites a normal person, right? So the sporozoites are actually considered as the infective stage, right? So the infective stage of Plasmodium vivax to man is the sporozoid stage, right? So once the sporozoid enters into the human because of the bite of the mosquito, these sporozoids from the blood, it directly moves into the liver. In the liver, what is happening? It is undergoing a process of multiple fission, that is schizogony. It's undergoing multiple fission, and the daughter cells that are formed are called as merozoites. Some of the merozoites, it would enter back into the liver and it would start evading the fresh liver cells. And I told you that this usually takes place for almost 8 days. We call it as pre-latent period where the symptoms are not seen. Then some of the merozoites, it would enter into the blood and it would reach the RBCs. It would get inside the RBCs, and inside the RBCs, it would start feeding on hemoglobin. As and when it is feeding on hemoglobin, it would start releasing a toxic substance which is called as hemozoin. Simultaneously, it would undergo the process of multiple fission also. Right. So once the hemozoid, through multiple fission, once more number of daughter merozoites are formed, then the RBC would rupture. Due to the rupture of this RBC, what is happening? More number of erythrocytic merozoites are released into the blood, and at the same time, this toxic substance hemozoin is also released into the blood. Now, this release of hemozoin is the one which shows us the symptoms. So symptoms are usually seen only upon the release of hemozoin, which is caused due to the rupture of RBCs. Right. Now, this erythrocytic merozoids would now get differentiated into male and female gametocytes. Right. Now, this male and female gametocytes would now start entering into a normal female Anopheles mosquito whenever this normal mosquito starts biting a patient who is suffering from this disease called malaria. So, this male and female gametocytes would now enter into the stomach of the female Anopheles mosquito. Once it enters into the stomach, inside the stomach, it would undergo a process of sexual reproduction. I told you, right? In case of humans, it is asexual reproduction. In case of mosquito, it is sexual reproduction. So through sexual reproduction, there is process of fertilization happening. As a result of fertilization, a diploid zygote is formed. And that diploid zygote will now get transformed into a structure called as ookinete. Once this ookinete is formed, this ookinete from the stomach, it now starts penetrating into the wall of the gut. Once it gets into the wall of the gut, it starts synthesizing a cyst around itself. And inside that cyst, there is more number of sporozoids which are formed. And that entire cyst, having this particular sporozoid, is actually called as the oocyst. Now, this oocyst, once it is full with sporozoids, it would rupture. Once it ruptures, all of the sporozoids are now released into the hemocoel. From the hemocoel, they start migrating into the salivary glands. And in the salivary glands, it remains in the salivary glands till this mosquito feeds on or starts biting another normal individual, where again the cycle would start continuing. Right? So this is the human phase and this is the mosquito phase. Asexual mode of reproduction here and sexual mode of reproduction here. Right? So this is what we have, the life cycle of the malarial parasite, which is called as Plasmodium vivax. Right? So we are completely done with this. We are left out with one more small topic. So that we'll take up with in the next session. Right? So that we'll be completely done with our topic called as the common diseases in case of humans. Right? So in the next session, we'll get into the second part of our chapter, which is called as the immune system or the immunity. Fine.